Lena's perfectly manicured nails curled around the coffee pot, the glint of her Cartier watch barely visible beneath the cuff of her silk sleeve. At 32, she certainly wasn't there to serve coffee at her in-laws' business, meeting out of some outdated sense of duty. No, this role had been thrust upon her, an insult wrapped in polite expectation, by Margaret, her condescending mother-in-law. "Be careful not to spill," Margaret sneered, tugging at the sleeves of her ill-fitting knockoff designer blazer. "We wouldn't want you embarrassing the family more than you already do." A ripple of laughter followed, a chorus of shallow amusement. But Lena barely reacted, her grip on the coffee pot unwavering. Behind her composed exterior, she was far more than the obedient wife they all assumed her to be. Lena Caldwell was the silent force behind one of the country's most powerful tech conglomerates. A secret carefully kept at her husband Ethan's insistence, all to avoid upsetting the fragile peace his mother so desperately clung to. While Margaret paraded him as the heir apparent, she remained unaware of the intricate chess game unfolding behind the scenes. Margaret's voice sliced through the air again, sharp and dismissive. "Hurry up, coffee girl. Our CEO is arriving soon, and we need to look professional." Lena's lips curved slightly, a flicker of amusement passing through her eyes. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The so-called acquisition they had all been anticipating? It wasn't quite the deal they imagined. For months, her company, Novatech Industries, had been quietly acquiring shares in her in-laws' failing business, strategically positioning itself for this very moment. The door swung open, and a familiar voice filled the room. "Apologies for the delay," said Daniel Park, Novatech's public-facing CEO, stepping inside with a confident stride. He barely made it 2 steps before his gaze landed on Lena, coffee pot still in hand. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Mrs. Caldwell?" She set the pot down smoothly and met his gaze. "Just Lena." Daniel recovered quickly, but his glance held a silent question. "Cream and sugar?" "Black, please." "Thank you." Margaret, ever eager to impress, practically shoved Lena aside. "Mr. Park, it's an honor to have you here," she gushed. "Please ignore our daughter-in-law. She's just helping out since we couldn't get proper catering today." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Your daughter-in-law?" Margaret sighed dramatically. "Unfortunately, yes. But let's focus on business." She launched into her well-rehearsed monologue, a grand speech about their proud family legacy and supposed market strength. Conveniently, she omitted any mention of their dwindling sales, their lost contracts, or the looming bankruptcy that threatened to dismantle everything they had built. And then, with a smug smile, she reached her grand conclusion. "With my son Ethan stepping in as CEO next month, we're expecting exponential growth." Lena's phone buzzed, an incoming notification reminding her of her next meeting. She rose from her seat, gathering her things. "I need to step out," she said. Margaret scoffed. "Typical. No respect for family matters. This is why we're keeping the business within the real family." Lena smiled then, the kind of smile that carried weight, subtle, knowing, and laced with quiet triumph. "Actually," she said smoothly, "I have a board meeting to attend. Daniel, I'll see you there." Silence fell over the room. Margaret's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "Board meeting?" Ethan stammered, his face draining of color. "Lena, what is going on?" She took her time, savoring the moment. "Perhaps," she said, placing a thick folder onto the table, "we should clarify who is acquiring whom." Margaret snatched up the folder, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "Novatech Industries," Lena continued, her voice steady. "My company currently owns 48% of your business. Today's offer is for the remaining 52%. Margaret's expression twisted in disbelief. "That's impossible. We would have known." "Would you?" Lena interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "Would you have known about the shell companies buying up your stock? Or the real reason your biggest contracts were canceled last quarter?" She tapped the folder. "It's all documented here." Ethan grabbed the papers, desperation creeping into his voice. "You've been spying on us? Your own family?" Lena chuckled, shaking her head. "No, Ethan. I did my homework." She held his gaze, unflinching. "Something you might have noticed if you'd actually read the reports I handed you last year. But you chose to trust your mother, didn't you? When she told you I was just meddling in family matters." Margaret frantically scanned the documents, her breaths growing shallower. "These numbers, they can't be right." Daniel nodded. "Mrs. Caldwell has been thorough. Everything checks out." Lena straightened her jacket, the faintest trace of amusement playing at her lips. All this time, you saw me as nothing more than a daughter-in-law. Just the coffee girl, she murmured. While you were busy trying to keep me in my place, I was studying everything about your company. Every weakness, every flaw. Ethan's voice trembled. We'll fight this. We'll get our lawyers. They work for the board, Lena interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. Not your family. And as of today, the board works for me. Margaret slumped into her chair, her expression clouded with disbelief. Why? She whispered. Why go through all of this? Why the pretense? Lena exhaled slowly, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. 5 years ago, I offered to help, she said. I had the expertise, the connections, the capital to turn things around. But you looked me in the eye and told me that gold-digging daughters-in-law should know their place. She glanced at her watch. Speaking of places, she said, turning to Daniel, I have a company to run. She walked toward the door, but Ethan's voice stopped her. Lena, wait. We can talk about this. She paused, just for a moment, then looked over her shoulder. Like we talked about it last Christmas? She asked softly. When your mother announced you as CEO and told me to focus on more appropriate things, like planning dinner parties? She shook her head, her voice cool but resolute. That time has passed, Ethan. Now it's time for business. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped into the elevator, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls. And in that moment, she saw something Margaret had never recognized. Lena Caldwell wasn't just a daughter-in-law. She was a force of nature. Her phone buzzed, another message from Daniel. Brilliantly played, boss. The board's ready when you are. Lena smiled. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, restructuring innovation leadership. But today was about justice, served with a dash of irony and the perfect cup of coffee. As the elevator doors opened, the hum of anticipation filled the air. Beyond the glass walls, reporters gathered, eager for a story. Let them tell it. Let them write about the woman they had underestimated. Let them witness the transformation of a failing business into something extraordinary. Because success, Lena thought, was the sweetest revenge of all. Lena's phone had been vibrating incessantly since that morning's revelations. The screen was filled with missed calls, 37 from Ethan alone, along with dozens of frantic text messages from Margaret. But what caught her attention the most was an unexpected email from her father-in-law, Robert. You've outplayed us all. I should have listened 5 years ago when I warned about our outdated systems. The company is yours now. Just please take care of our employees. At least one of them had the grace to accept defeat with dignity. The board meeting that followed was swift and decisive. Lena's restructuring plan was unanimously approved, and by evening, the company's stock had surged by 12% in response to the acquisition. The business world was already buzzing, praising the brilliant and calculated move that had unfolded right under her in-laws' noses. When she finally stepped out of the office, the crisp night air greeted her, carrying the lingering scent of city rain. But she wasn't alone. Leaning against her car, Ethan was waiting. His face was shadowed under the dim streetlight, but the anger in his voice was unmistakable. You've reached a new low, he spat, pushing off the car. Using our marriage to spy on my family's business? Lena remained composed, unlocking her door with practiced ease. Interesting, she mused. 5 years of watching your mother humiliate me was acceptable, but protecting a company and its employees from incompetent management is where you draw the line. Ethan's face reddened. Mom was right about you all along, he snapped. You're nothing but a... Lena didn't give him the satisfaction of finishing. Careful, she warned, her voice light but edged with steel. Your prenup becomes void if you publicly disparage me. Section 7, paragraph 3, the clause your mother insisted on. Ironically enough. His mouth opened, then shut, his face twisting with frustration. You won't get away with this, he hissed. Lena merely opened her car door, turning to him one last time. Oh, and by the way, I've already packed up my things from the house. The divorce papers will be arriving tomorrow. She gave him a cool, dismissive glance. Don't worry, I have no interest in your personal assets. I've got a business to run. As she drove away, her phone lit up with another message from Margaret. You'll regret this. No one will ever trust you in business again. Lena laughed, an actual full-bodied laugh. The absurdity of it all. Her inbox was already flooded with congratulatory messages from top CEOs, praising her strategic brilliance. In the business world, respect was earned through intelligence and execution, not through empty family politics. The weeks following the takeover were predictably dramatic. Margaret made a desperate attempt to rally the remaining family shareholders against Lena, only to find out that the contracts were airtight. Ethan, grasping at what little influence he had left, tried to assert his claim as CEO, but when faced with the board, his glaring lack of qualifications became painfully obvious. During his interview, Lena sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "Your mother's influence won't help you here," she told him simply. "We need a CEO who understands modern business practices, not someone who got the job through nepotism." The transformation of the company began immediately. Lena wasted no time introducing much-needed automated systems, creating a real HR department to address years of biased hiring and implementing transparent financial reporting. Employees who had suffered under the old management finally had the opportunity to thrive. Productivity skyrocketed, with efficiency rising 30% in just the first month alone. The toxic culture of fear and favoritism was swiftly dismantled, replaced with a system that rewarded merit and innovation. 3 months after the takeover, an unexpected visitor arrived at Lena's office. Margaret. She looked different, less polished, her usual bravado dulled. "I sold my house," she announced bluntly, as if it pained her to admit. "The one you used to compliment so much. Turns out it's expensive to maintain appearances when you're not misusing company funds." Lena didn't even glance up from the reports in front of her. "Is there a point to this visit?" Margaret hesitated before speaking again, her voice quieter this time. "How did you do it?" she asked. "All these years, serving coffee, enduring the insults. Why didn't you just tell us who you were?" Lena finally met her gaze. "Would you have believed me?" she asked, her voice steady. "Or would you have pushed Ethan to divorce me and marry someone more suitable?" She leaned back in her chair, studying the woman before her. "We were never family, Margaret. I was always the outsider, tolerated because Ethan refused to marry your friend's daughter. I was the coffee girl you could humiliate to feel better about your own insecurities." Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And now you've lost everything." Margaret's shoulders sagged, the weight of her downfall pressing into her frame. "And Ethan," she murmured. Lena's expression remained cool. "Ethan made his choice," she said simply. "Every time he sat there in silence while you belittled me." She turned her attention back to her work. "The divorce will be final next week." After Margaret left, Lena received another email from Robert. "I watched your presentation to the shareholders today. For the first time, I truly saw what Ethan and Margaret were too proud to acknowledge. You've given this company exactly what it needed. For what it's worth. I'm sorry." A year after the takeover, Lena stood before the company's annual meeting, addressing a crowd that now saw her not as an interloper, but as a leader. Under her guidance, the stock price had doubled, employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and the company had expanded into 3 new markets. She concluded her speech with a knowing smile. "Someone once told me I was just a coffee girl. Today, I want to thank them, because sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all." The applause was thunderous, echoing through the hall as she stepped away from the podium. That evening, as she worked late in her office, her assistant entered with an unexpected guest, Melissa, the woman Margaret had once hoped Ethan would marry. "I heard you're hiring for a management position," Melissa said hesitantly. "I know this is awkward, given everything. But I have an MBA from Harvard. Unlike Ethan, I actually earned mine." Lena studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You know what the hardest part of success is, Melissa?" she asked. "Remembering to give others the chance you wish someone had given you." She gestured toward a chair. "Let's talk about your qualifications." 2 years after the takeover, an elegant wedding invitation arrived on Lena's desk. Ethan was remarrying, a real estate agent, far removed from the corporate world his mother had once envisioned for him. Margaret had relocated to Florida, where she was rumored to spend her days lamenting about her scheming ex-daughter-in-law, to anyone who would listen. Lena sent a wedding gift. A coffee maker. The accompanying note read, "Some people serve coffee. Others build empires. Congratulations on your wedding, and best wishes. Your ex-CEO." Every morning, as Lena walked into the office, she passed the new company motto hanging in the lobby. "Success is best served with a side of humble beginnings." And every morning she smiled, because in the end, the coffee girl had become something far greater than they ever imagined.